Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing another really awesome guest for you. Today on the show, we have the honor of being joined by Neil Klompas, who is President and Chief Executive Officer, as well as Director of Augurex, which is a really interesting company focused on developing and commercializing these advanced diagnostics, ultimately with the aim of improving patient outcomes and ending so-called diagnostic delays across various autoimmune conditions. Neil has been involved in the healthcare and biotech industry for over 30 years now in various senior leadership roles spanning operations, finance, R&D. Most recently, he served as President and Chief Operating Officer at Zymeworks, where he held the role of Chief Financial Officer as well. Prior to that, Neil experienced various roles. He was at KPMG, the global financial services firm, both the US and Canada. He was advising on all sorts of transactions and financial engagements across pharma, biotech, as well as medical devices. He also serves on the board of directors of InMed, of NervGen, which we covered on the show before, and then HTuO Biosciences. He's also previously served as director on various other biotech companies, including the boards of Ovensa and Liminal Biotherapeutics. Neil holds a bachelor's of science degree undergraduate from the University of British Columbia, went on to become a chartered accountant and chartered professional accountant, and honored to have him on the show. A lot of cool topics to get into today. Neil Klompas, welcome.
Hey, Ira, thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. Really, really great to have you. Before we get into all things diagnostics and autoimmune diseases, would love to hand things over to you for a little bit, just to further introduce yourself. I love when somebody, starts out not originally doing a healthcare degree of some type, in your case, accounting, and sort of went fast and furious into all things health, biopharma, medical devices. Tell us a little bit about your background story, if you don't mind.
Oh, geez. Well, it actually starts a bit before the undergrad degree, as you mentioned. Now, straight out of school, I found myself working as a medic with the Army. I actually served overseas at the tail end of Gulf War I, and then transitioned into being a paramedic in the real world, so to speak. It's really where I developed my passion for patient-centric care. I found I was actually good at making a difference. Then a group of emergency room docs took me aside one day and said, "Kid, you're pretty smart. Why don't you go to college?" And that was really the start of going, I wonder what else I could be doing. So that led me to that path. Spent a bit of time in the lab with a federal research grant where I figured I loved science, but I really didn't want to pipette for the rest of my life. So that kind of got me asking the question, God, what else can I do with this science background, this love of science, this, history of patient-facing care? Most people's first answer wouldn't be a CPA, but that was kind of where I found myself saying, well, if I combine a little bit of finance with this, where does it put me? And it really puts me in the biotech industry, where it put me at that point in time. And then just really fell in love with the industry. As I'm sure you know, and a lot of your prior guests have said, there's probably easier ways to make a buck, but there's fewer ways that you can make as big an impact as you can in developing a new therapeutic or a new diagnostic or device. And that's really what got me started on this path.
Awesome. Yeah, I know the feel of the addiction of this industry, and I spent a lot of time here myself, but I know exactly where you're coming from on that. It's interesting, Neil, because on some of our previous shows, we've had the opportunity to profile a lot of these sort of lesser known autoimmune diseases. A lot of people that watch the show know obviously rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis and Crohn's disease and stuff like that. But autoimmune diseases as a family has dozens of other conditions that we don't normally hear about. And again, getting ready for this show with you today, until I heard about you, was unaware of something known as axial spondyloarthritis, and was shocked to learn that it's a sizable chunk of the total back pain market that's out there. Obviously, a lot of people have back pain, but a couple million have this unique autoimmune disease that causes back pain that until again last week I didn't know existed. And I'm sure I'm admitting something probably about my ignorance here, but would love to again start off just with explaining what axial spondyloarthritis is, how many people it affects, and sort of what it entails in terms of its pathology.
Yeah, thanks, Ira. And first off, no need to apologize for not knowing about it. I've spent the last 15, 16 years in oncology myself. And when I found myself in autoimmune and rheumatology, I had the same question. So what is axSpA and why aren't we talking about it? And again, you're exactly right. There's a lot of knowledge around complex autoimmune diseases like psoriatic arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Crohn's. They all get a lot of airtime. Yet when you dig into it, I think there's this real unmet medical need, both in the diagnostic realm, but even taking a step back and just talking about awareness
Right.
of axSpA. And we can refer to it as inflammatory back pain to really differentiate it from mechanical back pain. And this is where I think a foundation in understanding the disease takes shape. You're right. I mean, the World Health Organization's data and some of the NIH data points at 28% of adults experiencing chronic back pain at some point lasting more than 3 months. So, extending that's about 72, 73 million American adults will experience chronic back pain. And for the majority of them, it's probably a twist, a fall, some kind of sports accident, getting up wrong in the morning. But I think we as individuals extend that to all back pain, right? It might be, hey, I'm getting older, or I need to go to the gym more, or I need a better pair of runners, something like that. But axial spondyloarthritis, axSpA, is an autoimmune inflammatory disease in many ways similar to rheumatoid arthritis, where the body's immune system attacks joints. But in this case, we're not talking about knees and elbows and fingers. We're talking about the spine.
Mm.
Interestingly, data coming out of the University of Manchester points at surveys out of early back clinics that 10 to 14% of all recurring back pain patients that they're seeing are autoimmune in nature. So that's a sizable chunk. And in fact, if you look at the peer-reviewed literature on prevalence rates, rheumatoid arthritis, which I think we've all heard about at some point in time, the accepted prevalence rate is about 0.6 to 0.8% of the population. The data shows us that axial spondyloarthritis, inflammatory back pain, has a 1.4% prevalence rate in North American adults. That's more than double.
Yep.
So the question is, why aren't we talking about it? And it's, again, we're lumping all back pain into either mechanical or this inevitability of aging.
Right.
With that kind of prevalence rate of 1.4%, the incidence rates, though, that NIH is tracking is less than a quarter of the reported RA cases. So you've got this real mismatch. Like, we know these patients are out there, but they're not being diagnosed. And again, the data shows us that somebody that develops joint pain and rheumatoid arthritis will get a diagnosis and a referral to rheumatology typically between 1 to 2 years. In axial spondyloarthritis, the average is 7 to 10 years. The North American broader average is 9. So people are living with increasing back pain for almost a decade. either writing it off as inevitable because they're aging, or getting trapped in this cycle of physical therapy, chiropractic, massage, swearing they'll work out more. And in many cases, once you get past that 5-year break point, starting to take pain management to that next level with opioid therapy, just trying to find some relief for that chronic back pain. And at 5 years, you start to see a progression from non-radiographic into radiographic axSpA, where you start to see damage on the MRIs and X-rays. You start to see spinal fusions, and we're talking about permanent disability. And the sad thing is, while peripheral joints can be dealt with total knee or total hip replacements, we haven't quite figured out how to do that with the spine yet. So this is a leading cause of disability and spinal pain. And the really interesting thing is, with this disease effectively hiding in plain sight, most of the therapeutics that we use to treat, peripheral inflammatory arthritis, RA, the TNF alpha inhibitors, the IL-17 inhibitors, the JAKs, they actually all have approved labels in axSpA as well. So it's not like we can't treat this disease. The challenge is that diagnostic delay that we called out, that 7 to 10 years where people just aren't getting the right referrals. If we can refer it, we can treat it. And so part of that is identifying. Really interestingly, and this is a piece of peer-reviewed literature that lives in my head rent-free all the time. A paper came out of Yale earlier this year, and it said that, and it was really looking at non-rheumatologists, so primary care physicians. So in the sample set of, I think it was over 1,000 docs they talked to, when asked if they consider inflammatory back pain, axial spondyloarthritis, when a patient presents with back pain, 20% said never. I just don't consider it. And 50% said sometimes. So we're talking at 70% of docs either never or only sometimes even consider this disease when a patient presents with back pain. Moreover, because we don't have great awareness around this disease and great diagnostic tools, quite often primary care physicians will order lab work based on what they do know, which is RA. And interestingly, the two main biomarkers used to diagnose rheumatoid arthritis, ANA and rheumatoid factor, aren't present in this disease. So even ordering the wrong biomarker, the wrong lab test can send a primary care physician down the wrong path, saying, well, this isn't autoimmune. That was the opportunity that Augurex identified. We're a small diagnostics developer. We've been focused in autoimmune. We're founded in 2007 looking at rheumatoid arthritis. And a few years ago, we started to ask, what next? And we really identified this opportunity.
It's it's very interesting. So as you're saying here, just to sum that part up, long time for proper diagnosis, and then these years that go by, patients in pain, degenerative processes continue to go on, leading to irreversible spine damage, and at the same time, a lot of these autoimmune diseases are, I'll use a scientific term, kind of leaky in the sense that it can trickle down and affect other systems, other organs. One of the things I was reading, you mentioned there rheumatoid factor and ANA before. It also mentioned that some material that I guess tried to look at CRP and then the human leukocyte antigen gene as well, which I guess is, but even those aren't great, and they don't sort of manifest properly for an early diagnosis either. Can you say a couple words about sort of what goes wrong with those biomarkers as well, and then we'll get to the crux of the matter in terms of 1433.
Definitely. So you're right. CRP and then a genetic marker, HLA-B27, are commonly used and are part of the classification criteria for axSpA. CRP, or C-reactive protein, is a broad inflammatory biomarker. It does show up in diseases like rheumatoid arthritis. The challenge with CRP is it's a broad inflammatory marker. So you'll see elevated levels after intensive exercise quite often. You can find it elevated following a cardiac event and in some systemic infection. So while it does tell you that something inflammatory is going on, it doesn't help you pinpoint what the cause is.
Right.
Similarly, HLA-B27, a genetic marker, has been linked to predisposition and a likelihood of having axSpA. Now, it doesn't mean because you've got HLA-B27, you've got axSpA, but it means you do have a increased likelihood. The challenge is HLA-B27 isn't uniformly expressed in different populations. In Asian populations, expression is much lower. In South African, it's much lower. And in indigenous North American peoples is actually much higher. So you do have this lack of uniformity across different patient populations that can make it tricky to use. But again, both of them are better than nothing. And as we've been looking at, where does our novel biomarker, anti-1433 play, we've looked at it in combination to say, does it move the needle in a way that really makes a difference to patients and their physicians when combined with and used, separately than CRP and HLA-B27?
Gotcha. Yeah, let's go into the realm of 1433 because, again, this is again, in preparing for you and this show, I learned all about it. Did not really know much about it prior to this, but here we have a very interesting protein that's involved in many parts of the inflammatory cascade, and he I sort of referred to a lot as sort of this immunomodulator, right? There's sort of a Goldilocks zone for too little not good, too much not good, and normally provides an important sort of balance in all these different pathways and MF-kappa beta and JAK-STAT and all these other interesting immune activation inflammation pathways that we've talked about on the show. Take us into the world of 1433 because there's issues, of course, with the protein that we want the proper amount of it. And I know you've developed the test there, but then there's the autoantibody, which is where the autoimmune component comes into that a subset of patients produces that kill it or break it down too fast that lead to many of these conditions that we're talking about. So take a little time and walk us through the world of 1433.
Great. One of my favorite topics. So 1433 itself, I just admitted to how nerdy I was there, didn't I? But for the 1433 family of proteins have lots of different roles, typically as intracellular chaperone proteins. And it is a family. There are actually 7 different isoforms of 1433. And they play roles in everything from signal transduction in different pathways to cell cycle regulation. Certain isoforms are prominent in stress responses within the cell. Some of them are influenced in cellular and cytoskeletal dynamics, cell shape, motility, and in metabolic regulation. So they're typically found within the cell. These are not free circulating cytokines. If they're doing their job, they're within a cell and they're helping to make sure these mechanical functions, cell cycle regulation, are happening as they should.
Right.
If we take a step back and just ask what makes a good biomarker, quite often good biomarkers are things that are at higher levels than they would be in a healthy cell or a healthy system. But quite often, and is the case with 1433 eta, the isoform that we've focused on, a good biomarker is something which is normally intracellular that you find circulating in blood and serum. And that's exactly where the early discoveries from 1433 eta pointed us. 1433 eta was identified, I believe, around 2003, 2005, and implicated in cells that, as you mentioned earlier, involved in the JAK-STAT and TNF pathways, but really free circulating when it should be in the cell. And it was first identified in cerebrospinal fluid, which caused the kind of the research to say, well, is it free circulating when you have autoimmune disease? So in a panel looking at different inflammatory diseases, the protein really stood out on those early gels within rheumatoid arthritis. So our first development, going back to 07, 08, and commercialization between 2013, 2015, was really developing an ELISA-based assay to detect 14,338 in serum for rheumatoid arthritis. And 14,338 has a couple of really great characteristics that make it ideal for an autoimmune and inflammatory test. You find it free circulating early in disease development. So it's a great early biomarker. It can be found independent of rheumatoid factors. So when we think of seronegative inflammatory diseases, like seronegative rheumatoid arthritis, like juvenile idiopathic arthritis, and axial spondyloarthritis, it makes it a good biomarker. Again, 20% of RA is seronegative. So it allows you to even pick out these subtypes of RA. It's also highly modifiable, which means that levels will increase or decrease in conjunction with joint damage. So when you think about monitoring how you're performing, and again, in rheumatoid arthritis, there is rotation through different disease-modifying therapies. Patients will start on the TNF alphas, maybe move on to the IL-17s, especially when there are flares. It's good for understanding if a rheumatologist sees levels increasing, that modifiability, that difference of levels in the bloodstream can help guide therapeutic choices. Also, it's really been indicated in the likelihood of progression. So a lot of physicians, especially in Europe, use a treat-to-target approach, which is it's less based on radiographic or kind of inflammatory markers and more on is the patient feeling better? Honestly, are they more mobile? Do we have more joint mobility? Is the inflammation gone down? However, there are some peer-reviewed papers out there that point at, even with a treat-to-target strategy, high 14,338 levels increase the chance of radiographic possession or progression, which means you probably shouldn't taper a therapy. So it's got a lot of utility. What we noticed, though, was that when we started looking outside rheumatoid arthritis, it was less prevalent in a couple of other seronegative diseases, and that was the protein. So the protein is being cleared by the immune system, which led us down the path to, all right, are there autoantibodies that can be used to show us that 14,338 was there? So we started looking for the existence of autoantibodies, so antibodies the human body has generated against this protein. And again, those gels really lit up in axial spondyloarthritis, which was the aha moment for our research team.
It's so interesting thinking about this. We normally think about, we think about pharmacogenomics and things like this and the personalization. We normally think, in cancer and certain tumor types, but the fact that you're pointing out these little differences, and makes you wonder how many types of RA there are out there, how many types of axSpA. But yeah, take us so. The original protein, as you were mentioning, was known as JointStat, which is the first product you created. What you created recently, which just, your announcement was just a couple of weeks ago, got breakthrough designation by FDA, is SpineStat, which is the novel diagnostic test that talks about, focuses on 14,338 autoantibodies. Again, take us down there a little bit. What went into that development, and again, thinking about this personalization, this pharmacogenomic stuff. How many types of axSpA do you think there may be? And how many the ways they manifest? Because as you point out, there's millions of people that got it. It'd be interesting to, probably not there yet, but to understand how these tests and ultimately, how they present can stratify for treatment and whatever the best treatments may be for something like this down the road. But take us down.
Yeah, great question. So Whereas a lot of people haven't heard of axial spondyloarthritis. In fact, one of the other terms that's associated with this disease, ankylosing spondylitis,
Yep.
is sometimes actually recognized. Ankylosing spondylitis refers to radiographic axSpA, so disease that is detectable on MRI and X-ray, whereas we call pre-radiographic progression non-radiographic axSpA. So there's really
Okay.
two primary distinctions within the space. But I think it's fair to say even that is hotly debated within the rheumatology community. Should we just be talking about axial spondyloarthritis? And even should we just be talking about SPA? Should we just be talking about spondyloarthropathies as a general class and
Right.
really not worrying about this disaggregation? The data that Augurex with our collaborators presented at the most recent American College of Rheumatology, which was just a few weeks ago at ACR Convergence 25, actually highlighted that the performance of the autoantibody-based test, SpineStat, performed similarly for both radiographic and non-radiographic axSpA. So as far as we're concerned, we haven't seen on the scatter plots and on the rock curves really those two forms of the disease separating statistically. So for us, we don't actually have to worry about those different types, which is great. I think the most important thing that we did see, and frankly, this was thanks to the FDA pointing us in the right direction, was, not only can we differentiate axSpA patients, inflammatory back patients from healthy patients, but importantly, can we differentiate them from mechanical back pain? And honestly, the first time we started talking to FDA, we had great data compared to healthy patients. And they kind of said, well, yeah, but it's not healthy people that are going to go in and get this test. It's patients with back pain. Can you differentiate between mechanical and inflammatory back pain? And that was, all thanks to some of that early FDA feedback. We were able to go back, work with collaborators here in Canada and in the UK, and source patient populations that were both mechanical and inflammatory back pain, and show that not only could we tell the difference, but as far as our test was concerned, mechanical back pain performed similarly in those scatter plots to healthy controls.
Got it.
We've got more studies planned. Atul Deodar at Oregon Health Sciences University, the former co-chair of the Spartan Working Group, which is the largest axSpA clinical consortia, in an independent interview, kind of let the cat out of the bag that we're going to be included in the upcoming Spartan Basis study, which is looking at resetting the standard of care and the diagnostic guidelines for axSpA. We're the first novel biomarker to be included. Knock on wood, he's let the cat out of the bag, but ink's not quite dry on that one yet. So hopefully everything continues to work the way it should be, and we're included in that study. But for us, that was really recognition that, the clinical community needs new tools in this space.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've talked a lot about, also the patient perspective, which is what we always try to keep front and center. It's kind of guides our values in the development of this tool. But if we think about healthcare systems as well, we've talked about how it takes a long time to get into rheumatology. The rheumatology community also suffers with the inverse of that problem. Quite often, primary care physicians will throw their hands up and go, I don't know, I've looked at everything with this back pain patient. A ChatGPT or a Wikipedia search will say, well, maybe it's inflammatory. The current referral rate to rheumatology for back pain patients is 7 negative back pain referrals for every 1 positive SPA referral. Yeah. So we are jamming up these rheumatology specialists with patients that are negative just because there's no way to screen them early. So if we think about the time that's taking that those docs could be with actual autoimmune conditions, and healthcare costs, which is, one of those front and center things, we could make a real impact there. Spartan's guidelines in testing is to try to get that number down to 3 to 1. with a combination of surveys, referrals, better questionnaires. The data that we had presented at ACR 25 was that we can actually beat that 3-to-1 referral rate based on using SpineStat in combination with CRP and HLA-B27. We get closer to 2.5 to 1 instead of 7 to 1 where it is today. So, and we're hoping to improve that with some development and research iterations on the study to improve specificity. So we're pretty excited that we'll have that impact not only on patients, but on the care providers that are trying to find ways to make room for these patients in their practices.
Gotcha. And could you talk a little bit about the commercial side here? Because I know that you work with some group called Sonic Reference on the Joint Stat project, and I think I saw some about a group called New Day Diagnostics. You're working on SpineStat. Could you, for sort of a drug development guy, could you talk just a little bit about sort of what sort of the global regulatory commercial process is for stuff like this? Because I think it through, like, I mean, again, in getting ready to talk to you, I looked at sort of some of the thought leaders in axSpA, and it was like literally like a handful, and I was sort of thinking, like, what's the process? I mean, you get these thought leaders on first, like, what's the whole strategy here between how you ultimately get to all the rheumatologists out there, or all the orthopedic folks or whatever, that are seeing these types of patients?
Yeah, great question, Ira. And it is a different game. Again, I've spent most of my career in drug development. So understanding those subtle differences between diagnostics development and, build a drug, partner with a global pharma, get the drug to market, there are some interesting complexities. The first is, the basic science that goes on in the lab is probably no different. I mean, it's slightly different, but it's optimization, rewriting the right studies, figuring out your mechanisms, and then optimizing them through clinical studies to figure out, do we have something that works, or is there more work that's required? The big advantage that we have as diagnostics developers is our clinical studies, to do a 200 to 700 patient study can take us a month. It's a lot faster, especially when there are great identified retrospective patient sample sets out there, which is why, as you said, you want to work with these thought leaders, these key opinion leaders that have these biobanks in their hospitals and universities of patient samples. We just received another set from a leading KOL in Great Britain just last week. And I was really excited to hear that an entire biobank of HLA-B27 negative samples are on their way from Japan. So to be able to test it and have first-in-class data in a specified HLA-B27 negative patient population will be kind of the first of that data of its kind. So we're really excited. So that's one of the big differences and why we want to work with these key opinion leaders and these thought leaders out there. The next is really a choice that I think every diagnostics developer has to make, which is, how do we get this into the hands of patients? There's really only one path when you're building a therapeutics, right? Run your phase 1, 2, 3, approach FDA, then usually partner with big pharma because they've got reps with drugs in their bag. For a diagnostics developer, that path actually diverts really early in the development cycle. You can go down the traditional FDA approval route. It's actually parallel to the medical device route, typically with either a 510(k) approval or what's called a de novo approval, which is the pathway we find ourselves in when there's no predicate pathway. Again, we would be the first diagnostic with a label in the US for axSpA. However, there is a parallel path within the US to getting a diagnostic into the hands of patients and docs, which is called the LDT, or laboratory developed testing pathway, which is what a lot of drugs, or a lot of diagnostic tests, actually progress down. The LDT pathway was actually on the cutting block a couple of years ago. And due to, I think, industry trying to work with government to kind of reinforce how important the LDT pathway is, It was kind of overturned earlier this year, and the LDT pathway is still available. And what that means is that federally licensed labs that have a CLIA certification can certify a test by doing the workup and the validation themselves, as long as they're not selling that test commercially to other people. And that makes sense. For example, if you have a lab and you want to spin up a cholesterol test, people know how to do a cholesterol test. They've known that for 50 years. Why would you go out and buy a branded cholesterol test if you can buy the reagents and run the test?
Yeah.
So a lot of folks just do that. They'll develop a test in-house. And that was how JointStat, our first test, is actually offered through Quest, through LabCorp, now through Sonic, through ARUP, and a couple of other labs, which we hope to announce in Q1. So for us, it was, let's get into that LDT pathway. We made the choice not to build our own testing facility and have all the blood work come into us. For us, we've stayed small, nimble, and virtual, and partnered with the people that actually have those bricks and mortars labs. So diagnostic developers have that choice to make as well. Not only FDA or LDT, but do I build a testing lab and have people send me samples, or do I partner with people that are really good at that? And that's what we've done. LabCorp's recent rebrand into LabCorp in Autoimmune makes national reference labs like them a great partner to work with. So that's our path to getting us out there. You're right. JointStat, our first test, is offered widely across the US. We also have Health Canada approval, and it's offered in Canada. And earlier this year, we announced regulatory approval in the UK. SpineStat, our new test for axSpA, just received FDA breakthrough designation, and we're looking at a parallel track for that asset, both continuing down the FDA de novo pathway, but in the meantime, looking to work with our existing lab partners, Quest, LabCorp, AirUP, Sonic, and others, to get this broadly into the hands of patients, and then flip into an FDA-approved product.
And not that you don't have enough on your plate, but once you've taken care of axSpA, and everything's going there. I mean, clearly looking at this list of even just the unmet autoimmune conditions, there's something like 90 other things on this list. Could you say a few words about sort of the, obviously nothing confidential, but what the future, I mean, are you going to plan to knock off each of these autoimmune diseases one at a time? Are you going into other areas? What's the long-term plan here? Because you clearly are really good at creating these tests, and there's a lot of unmet conditions out there that clearly this fit right into. So take us down that path a bit, Neil.
Yeah, as I mentioned in some of those early gels, 1433-eta and auto 1433-eta, and actually a couple of variants of 1433 that are citrulinated, did light up in a couple of these other diseases. So we're really excited to look at its applications outside axSpA and RA. We're actually looking at combining the autoantibodies and the antibodies for a next generation higher sensitivity RA test that we're calling Rheumostat. That's going to be really interesting. And our next area of target is psoriatic arthritis. There's a huge unmet medical need in psoriatic arthritis as well. I think something that's in the back of our mind, which is really exciting, is at-home testing. So we've actually developed a working prototype of a finger prick test that uses, I think it's 5 microliters of blood. People during COVID got really good at running and reading lines on a strip type tests. So we see a future in which, at least in axSpA and maybe even in RA, patients don't have to worry about that early referral. If you're struggling with back pain, you could get a positive, negative early look at whether there's an inflammatory process by using a companion app with a line on a strip through a lateral flow based test to determine, hey, should I be talking to my doctor about, an inflammatory condition, and starting that path even earlier. I think there's a lot of focus on patients taking more control of their own health, disaggregating it from hospital visits, pairing it more with digital, with the rise of some of the musculoskeletal care platforms. like Hinge, like Sword, like Kaya. You know, musculoskeletal physical therapy has moved digital. We think there's a path there first, but you've probably spoken to enough biotech developers. The name of the game when you're small and nimble is trying to stay focused, knocking one thing out of the park, maybe two, before you spread your focus too broad. So right now, we're super focused on making sure that SpineStat addresses that area of high unmet need and gets into the hands of patients as soon as we can.
I was like fantasizing if you had $1 trillion in the bank, what you would do with it. But yeah, again, no. But what you're pointing at here is really important, especially for our show, because we do profile aging in place. We profile the virtual sort of distributed clinical trial model that's coming online now, and of course, just health in the home and where we're going. And I think you're really nicely positioned here as a lot of that stuff comes online. So that's really exciting. What else should we be on the lookout for, Neil, coming up? I know that I think last week we were at the ACR, giving a poster session. You're at some of these other rheumatology conferences. Tell us sort of the beginning of 2026. What's coming up that's public facing that we should know about? Places that we could run into you, meet you, listen to you present. Anything else they have while I have you today, please.
Yeah, great. So we're a pretty constant fixture at some of the larger rheumatology conferences. The next abstract data that we're going to be presenting across a host of our different products will likely be submitted to EULAR. It's the European equivalent to the ACR conference.
Yeah.
As well, I believe the British Society for Rheumatology's conference is coming up early next year. So we'll be presenting there. Aside from that, we try to be present in a lot of the small regional rheumatology conferences where we can speak to the rheumatologists that are actually practicing and seeing patients. But the real opportunity for SpineStat is in primary care. If it's taking patients 7 to 10 years to see a rheumatologist, if we keep focusing on rheumatology, we're not impacting diagnostic delay. So you can look for us at some of the conferences next year that focus on primary care, at musculoskeletal care. And our real focus is, the people that are seeing some of these back pain patients, not monthly like their primary care physicians are, but sometimes twice a week. So the physical therapists and physiotherapists, really getting into who's seeing these patients early, increasing awareness. You can look for us working with the patient-facing organizations like the Spondyloarthritis Association of America. SAA is doing some great work. Our co-founder and chair of the board was actually interviewed by SAA and released on their podcast yesterday. And as far as patient advocacy groups going, we're trying to work with the patient advocacy groups in the US, in Canada, in the UK, and frankly, some of the international federations like ASIF.
Again, it's I love seeing companies that not just go through the research process as you were talking when we're in sort of the drug development realm, but getting to market with these important services that ultimately impact patients. And it's what you're doing, and I'm excited for you. And I think it's a great story, and really impressive that you've done all this in such a short period of time with the company. Again, for everybody out there that is going to be listening to this episode across the various podcast networks, or who will be watching on the YouTube channel. You've been spending time with Neil Klompas, President, Chief Executive Officer, Board Director of Augurex, doing really amazing things to not just develop but commercialize these advanced diagnostics for all sorts of patients with autoimmune conditions. Neil, again, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us today and educate us on some of these topics we don't normally get into. Thank you for everything you do there for patients. And as we like to say here on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for people via what you do and type of science you champion in there. Really an awesome story.
Great. Thanks, Ira. Always my pleasure. And thanks for helping get the word out about these conditions in autoimmune. I think, the first step is always raising awareness so patients can start working with their care providers and asking the right questions. So, podcasts like yours play a huge role in that. So thank you.
Really appreciate that. Really great having you.